following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zigzag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland, in the northern part of the great state of California. And I have, as usual, extremely interesting guest. I do that all the time. And it's just not an exception when I do. We're going to talk a little ball in the zone, baseball in particular. And the man is Jeff Kallman. How are you, sir?
So far, so good.
Good. It's the end of the season. I want to ask you what you do when you're jonesing ball. Do you read a book? Do you play sim leagues? Computer leagues where you punch in the old teams and get your Jones that way? Do you?
Well, I do read
you tell
books,
me.
But I do read books when I find good ones. I also know that just because the games have stopped, baseball does not. There is a hot stove season to keep an eye on. There are awards to be given out. There are Hall of Famers to be elected. So the time between the end of the World Series and the beginning of spring training isn't as painful as you might think it would be.
Nor is it as long as it used to be. It used to be like 6 months. And what with baseball ending in November rather than October?
Well, actually, it ended the day before Halloween this year.
That's true. That's true. There are
and
times
what an ending.
What an ending. You want to recap that great series that you basically projected would be evenly matched and 7 games. So I want to give you a lot of credit for that. We had a show.
We had you had two teams that were, like I said, evenly matched, and they weren't going to go down quietly as things turned out. As things also turned out, this was the first World Series in which the entire round of games was won on the road.
Right.
And in the case of the world champion Washington Nationals, and for you Washington fans, doesn't that just roll off the tongue after all these decades?
I went into it with my old hating Washington because I'm a Met fan view and hating Houston because I'm a Met fan view. But had to appreciate both teams, and I was so happy for the fans. My God, they suffered. I don't think there's a fan alive that remembers the last World Series. What was it, 1924?
Well, that was the only Major League World Series championship won by any Washington team. The last World Series of any kind in Washington was won in, I believe it was the final Negro League World Series in 1948 when the Washington-based Homestead Grays won that series.
You know, that's going to count for 2 reasons. Our fellow podcaster on the Comfortably Zoned Network, David Hubler, wrote the great book, The Nats and the Grays. And he believes that the level of play in the Negro League was comparable, if not superior, to Major League Baseball. What say you?
It was for a very long time. Now, what you have to remember is that in 1948, basically it was the beginning of the end for the Negro Leagues, because once the Major Leagues opened their doors to black players at long enough last, it was just a question of time before black talent would look toward the major leagues and not toward the Negro Leagues. And indeed, the Negro Leagues really didn't last another decade.
Right.
And there's another excellent book about Washington. and the Negro Leagues. It's called Beyond the Shadow of the Senators by a gentleman, I believe his name is Brad Snyder.
Okay.
And it's an excellent book. Among other things, it outlines a very complicated relationship between Senators owner Clark Griffith and black baseball and black baseball players, because on the one hand, Griffith was one of the few owners who actually thought about admitting blacks to his Senators, but on the other hand, at the time, before Happy Chandler became commissioner, Griffith was making more money hosting the Homestead Grays home games than he was with the Senators.
Wow.
So it was quite a catch-22 for him in those years. But yeah, the last Washington World Series of any kind was the Homestead Grays of 1948.
And isn't it interesting when it came time for expansion that Griffith wanted to go to Minnesota?
That was his nephew's bright idea. Clark Griffith was gone. Cal Griffith wanted to leave Washington in the worst way possible.
Why was that? What precipitated that?
He was not yet comfortable with the idea of playing baseball where half the population in the neighborhood was black.
Okay.
At least that's what I have read in multiple sources. And then the expansion Senators cooked their own goose thanks to the ownership of Bob Short, and he absconded with them to Texas.
Wow, does that ever hurt? Because they waited, and then came a drought of 24 years without baseball at all.
31 years.
Was it? Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, the second Senators left for Texas after the 1971 season. The Nationals arrived from Montreal starting for the 2005 season. So that's quite a long time for Washington not only to be without baseball, but without competitive baseball.
Mm-hmm.
And now they sit on top of the baseball world, basically. And it was quite a World Series, particularly the last couple of games in Houston. And especially Game 7. And just for those Astros fans who might be listening, I'm going to say it once. Hinch didn't blow it. The Nats won it.
Okay. That's
They are still carping over A.J. Hinch not bringing Garrett Cole in from the bullpen when the Nats started to puncture Zach Greinke. And I have written, and I will say again, Hinch's plan, and it was a solid one because Garrett Cole in his professional life had never thrown a single inning of relief. Never mind throwing him into the middle of an inning with even one runner on base. That's not what Cole was built for, and that's not what his career was. The only option he really had at that moment, and he still had a lead, yes, but the only viable relief option he had was Will Smith. Roberto Osuna had been too erratic in the postseason. As a matter of fact, going into Game 7, Osuna's postseason ERA was over 350, and his walks and hits per inning pitch rate was knocking on the door of 2. So Harris is the right move to make. Unfortunately, Hinch was right, and the only thing wrong with the move was wearing a Nationals uniform. And that's, unfortunately, with apologies to John Lennon, baseball happens when you're busy making other plans. The best team gets beaten now and then. The best pitchers in the game get beaten. The smartest managers in the game get beaten when they make the right move. There's only one more inviolable law in baseball than Berra's law, and that's the law that somebody has to lose. And now and then someone's going to beat the best you have in that moment. That's what happened to the Houston Astros in Game 7.
You know, there was the joking rumor going around that Houston threw the game so they wouldn't have to go to the White House.
I'm not even going to dignify that with a response.
Okay.
Whatever I do or don't think of the current administration, and the less I think about it, the better, I won't even dignify that with anything further.
It was a joke.
It's patent nonsense, and it wasn't even a funny joke.
Oh, of course it's nonsense, but it was a joke.
Remember, to be a joke, it has to be funny.
Well, depends on what side of the aisle you're on. Sometimes,
I'm on the side of the aisle that says a pox on both their houses.
That's really a good place to be, if you think about it. And
let's get back to AJ Hinch.
I was going to say, well, at least you didn't want to get back to Suzuki.
No,
okay.
This was not Joe McCarthy starting Denny Galehouse over Mel Parnell with the 48 pennant on the line. This was not Casey Stengel failing to align a World Series rotation so Whitey Ford could start more than 2 games in the 1960 World Series. This was not Gene Mott panicking when a rookie stole home on his best pickoff pitcher in 1964. This was not John McNamara with a weak bullpen and a heart overruling his brain to send an ankle-compromised first baseman out to play one more inning in the bottom of the 10th of Game 6, 1986. It wasn't Grady Little measuring Pedro Martinez's heart but forgetting to check his gas tank in Game 7 of the 2003 American League Championship Series. This was one of the most intelligent managers in the game, making the absolute right move, and it was not Hinch's fault that Will Harris threw Howie Kendrick the best pitch he had to throw, a cutter nasty off the middle toward the low outside corner, and then watched it bonk off the right field foul pole. Harris himself said it. Howie Kendrick made a championship play for a championship team.
He came up big. He was not having a good series. He was not having a good postseason, but he came up big when it mattered. And there are only so many heroes that we can look back upon. The Mazeroskis, the Carters. He joins that group, and well-deserved. Couldn't have been
the smartest managers in the game. I mentioned McCarthy and Stengel. Now, they were near the end of the Hall of Fame phases of their managing careers when they made those misjudgments I talked about before. Tony La Russa made a bad mistake in the 1990 World Series twice. He wouldn't even think about his Hall of Fame relief ace Dennis Eckersley earlier than the ninth inning save situations, and twice, if he had, he might have kept the A's in the game and kept the Reds from sweeping them, if not giving the A's more of a chance to win that series. So the smartest minds in the dugout get beaten.
No question, because
the real key to Game 7 and the Astros not winning is that they couldn't hit a gimp with a hangar door all game long. Max Scherzer was out there with all heart and all will and nothing but grapefruits, cantaloupes, and watermelons to throw to the plate. And the Astros couldn't do anything more than 2 runs against him.
Yes.
Zach Greinke was dealing trump for 6 innings. Max Scherzer was throwing grapefruits to the plate. And the Astros got 2 runs out of him and should have had more, but they weren't doing anything with men on base. They sent 7 Astros to the plate with men in scoring position in Game 7, and the only one who got a base hit in that situation was Carlos Correa. Yuli Gurriel's home run was a solo leadoff shot. That's the real key to the Astros losing Game 7. And now let's start giving some credit where it's due. They didn't lose it. The Nationals won it. And they beat the better team, and that's not exactly unheard of. You can find very few teams in baseball better than the 1906 Cubs, the 1914 Athletics, the 1954 Indians, the 1960 Yankees, the 1969 Orioles, the 1987 Cardinals, the 1988 and 1990 A's, the 2003 Yankees, and the 2006 Tigers. And every one of those lost World Series in those years, and only 2 of them went the distance before losing.
Well, and there, I think you mentioned it earlier on, all the games were won by road teams.
It was the first time it ever happened in the World Series.
Wow.
Ever. And this also may have been the single greatest upset in the history of the World Series. Not just because the Astros were series favorites going in by the largest margin ever, but the only team that was ever lower in the standings during the regular season before winning that year's World Series was the 1914 Braves. Remember, the Nationals were 19-31 at the end of play on May 23rd. And from May 24th forward, they had the best one-loss record in baseball, including through the postseason. Only one team was close to them by a hair, and that was the Astros.
Well, talk about Martinez
and the Astros,
and
Martinez,
his contribution to that.
It's very simple. On May 23rd, the Nationals are at the lowest of their low point, and the guillotine is being built for him. It's just a question of when, not whether, they're going to drop the blade on him. The following day, and I've seen numerous accounts of this, he told his players basically, today let's just go 1-0. And that was their mindset the rest of the season, other than let's have fun doing it. I don't think any team in baseball this year had more fun than the Nationals did.
Didn't they have a trainer throwing out the first ball? What was that about? There was some sort of ritual that they had going.
I don't know about the trainer throwing out the first ball, but on May 24th, a cancer-stricken young fan was brought out to throw out the first pitch. The Nationals won that day, and that started the ball rolling. And they brought him out to throw out a first pitch at one of the, I believe, National League Championship Series games while they swept the Cardinals. Yeah. Now, just to get to the World Series was not simple for either the Nationals or the Astros. The Dodgers were heavy favorites to get to the World Series until Howie Kendricks hit the grand slam in the 10th inning of Game 5. The Cardinals were the next favorite to get there, and they ran into a Nationals vacuum cleaner, beat, swept, and cleaned them 4 straight. The Astros didn't have it easy getting to the series. The Rays made them win a pair of elimination games first. And if it hadn't been for Aaron Boone making one mistake in Game 6 of the American League Championship Series, the Astros might not have been able to start Garrett Cole in Game 1 of the World Series. Remember, the Yankees tied Game 6 in the top of the 9th thanks to DJ LeMahieu. In the bottom of the 9th, for whatever reason, and Aaron Boone has made very few mistakes this year, but for whatever reason, he elected not to walk Jose Altuve with George Springer already on base and a spaghetti bat named Jake Marisnick on deck. And Jose Altuve made him pay for that mistake. That was Boone's only mistake. And I'll tell you the truth, I would, in a heartbeat, name Aaron Boone the manager of the year in the American League this year. The only question would be,
with all the injuries they had,
my God,
it was a no-brainer.
Almost, he says. Boone was having to run a MASH unit. There were times you wondered if the Yankee yearbook was to be the New England Journal of Medicine. And the fact that he kept his marble singular through all of that. If they name him Manager of the Year, I can't help wondering if this version of the trophy shouldn't have a music embedded into it that when Boone winds it up, it plays the theme to St. Elsewhere. Because that was the Yankee season in a nutshell. They led the show in the injured list and managed to win over 100 games. And by the way, for all those out there who were screaming bloody murder, and there were plenty of Yankee fans doing this, to dump Boone, bring back Girardi or some other yo-yo. I say this. Name one of only 2 Yankee managers who ever won 100-plus games in the first 2 seasons he managed the team. Aaron Boone is one. Guess who the other one was?
I know Casey was not one.
No, he wasn't. Neither was Joe McCarthy.
I would have to say John McGraw.
And John McGraw never managed the Yankees a day in his life.
Not John McGraw.
Not McCarthy.
John McCarthy, yes.
No, not Joe McCarthy and not Joe Torre.
Billy Martin?
No, 1,000 times no.
Mickey Stanley?
Now that's a joke, and that's funny. But no, the answer was Ralph Houck.
Ooh, good one. There's a guy, talk about Peter Principle. He reached the level of his incompetence when he became general manager. Is it?
No, there's a level of incompetence, and then there was Ralph Houck as a general manager.
Okay. So which came first, the chicken or the egg, in other words?
Yes, in his case.
He was a terrific manager, players manager. But
he was a good manager, and he was a terrible front office executive.
Right.
And the only other thing to say about his tenure as the Yankees general manager is that it was lucky for him that he didn't get thrown out of baseball because of two moves in particular. Number one,
Johnny
when Jim Bouton. That's number two. I'm going to mention this as number one because the Yankees could have been in bigger trouble over this. Jim Bouton held out in spring training '65, I believe it was, and Ralph Houck tried to fine him $100 for every day he held out. And what Houck didn't know was that it was actually against the rules of the time to do that. There are other ways you could bring a player to heel, but you were not allowed to fine him for a single dollar for any day of a contract holdout. Houck didn't know that. The Johnny Keane is number two, especially because it's been long verified that Houck reached out to Keane through back channels in the middle of the 1964 season to ask if he'd be interested in managing the Yankees if Houck wanted to get rid of Yogi Berra, which he did. Ralph Houck was lucky that the Yankees weren't slapped severely with Major League sanctions over those moves.
Yes. He was an enigma. He went on to have a pretty good managerial career with Detroit.
He went back into the dugout, which is where he really belonged, and it was his unhappy job to try to keep the Yankees in one piece during the lost decade from 1965 through 1975. And he did an admirable job, not to mention the fact that he was at the bridge when the seeds of the Yankees' return to competitiveness later in the 70s were planted. And then he did the same thing in Detroit and in Boston again in the early 80s. Houck went back where he belonged, basically, and made a fine career afterwards.
Absolutely. And it is my contention that the decline of the Yankees was not all the Yankees' fault. You remember, they were left with the remnants of a farm system that Webb and
Dan Topic and Del Webb let the farm system drain to lower the baggage for the sale to CBS.
And they also had some bad timing when Bobby Richardson came up lame, retired early.
That was Tony Kubek who came up lame. Bobby Richardson had always planned never to play more than 10 or 11 years in the major leagues. That was a Richardson plan from the outset. It was Tony Kubek whose throat and then back put paid to his career.
Right. getting back to why his throat was a problem, and Casey
the
Stengel,
hard hop in the 1960 World Series.
And you know the mistake you mentioned that Stengel made in saving Ford, this, that, and the other thing?
He didn't align his rotation properly. Whitey Ford should have had 3 starts in that series.
But it wasn't
Ford had
the only mistake.
It was the key mistake.
Well,
and Whitey Ford has two 1960 World Series shutouts as evidence for the prosecution.
Well, let me tell you about another mistake he made in that game, and it had to do with that ground ball hit to Kubek. Kubek never should have been in the game. It had been Casey's plan and habit throughout the last part of the season to take Kubek out, put him in left field, replace Berra in left, and put the slick fielding Joe DeMaestri in at shortstop. And he had done that successfully for a long time. He just fell asleep on the bench and didn't make that move. And boom, baseball gods catch up with you fast, because that ground ball...
No, the baseball gods don't catch up to you, but the Pittsburgh Pirates did.
Right. Smith had a lot to do with it, too, tying the game. But Hal Smith, the catcher, which Hal Smith was he? There was another catcher named Hal Smith in the National League at that time. One of the 2 Hal Smiths came from the Yankee organization. Which one? I always have trouble remembering that. I think it was the Hal Smith that hit the home run was originally in the Yankee organization when they were producing catchers to beat the band. Sherm Lawler, Gus Triandos, besides Ralph Houck, Joey Solera, Yogi.
All right, the Hal Smith acted in the 1960 World Series was the ex-Yankee. He was one of the players in the 1964 deal that was the largest swap of players in baseball history at the time.
Baltimore, right?
Yep, that was the trade.
Brought him Bob Turley and Don Lawson.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
That's the deal. That's the Hal Smith who hit the home run in Game 7.
Wow. Another guy in that trade was one of my favorites as a kid, Willie Miranda. Always liked Willie Miranda. He was Cuban, and my father, when he emigrated to this country, couldn't get in right away. He had to go to Cuba, escaping the war. So I've always had an affinity for Cubans, Minnie Minoso, and what have you.
Willie Miranda was the class good field shortstop.
Good field, no hit, right?
And now I'm sure you're aware of this, but right now the Modern Era Committee, one of the successor committees to the old discredited Veterans Committee, is deciding on Hall of Fame candidates. The list is 9 players and 1 non-player, and the results will be announced on December 8th.
Okay.
And I want to run some of those players down here right now, alphabetically. Dwight Evans, Red Sox right fielder, better player than a lot of people remember. He had a very strange dichotomy in his career. It was pointed out most vividly in a book called The Cooperstown Casebook by Jay Jaffe, who pointed out that Dwight Evans had an early peak value on defense, and his hitting had a late career peak value. It was opposite poles with Evans. The first half of his career, basically, he was a great right fielder. Second half of his career, he was an excellent hitter. And he rates out on the objective scores as the number 15 right fielder of all time, though he is a little bit below the Hall of Fame averages for hitting at his position. He's going to be a tricky call, but he was a terrific player. Steve Garvey is on the modern era ballot now, and Garvey is kind of the opposite of Evans. Garvey wasn't as good as people remember him being, and now that's not a disqualifier, of course. What does get in the way of Garvey is this, and Bill James put it the best in the new historical baseball abstract book. Garvey was self-programmed to a fare thee well. James called him a clockwork baseball player. Let himself have only certain times to swing, take, try to kill a pitch, try to just get the bat on the ball, and so on and so forth. And it didn't matter what the game situation was almost.
Okay.
He was a good player. He could be excellent quite often. He might have been great, but he came short enough. And the
10-time All-Star.
Fan voting. What does that matter? Have you seen how the fans have voted for All-Stars over the years? I wouldn't exactly put a lot of credence in that.
Well, then any award is subjective, and can you put a credence in, say, DeGrom winning two Cy Youngs in a row, which he's about to do,
and he will have earned them.
I know he will.
Those awards come from people who pay far closer attention to the nuances of the game than the ordinary fans in the stands do. Now, getting back to Steve Garvey, the objective measurements say that there are 26 first basemen better than him all time who are not in the Hall of Fame, and one of them is an active player, and that's Paul Goldschmidt.
Yes, he's terrific.
Now, Tommy John is a unique case. Taken without the surgery that bears his name, he was a good pitcher long before the surgery. He was a good pitcher long afterwards. Sometimes he was terrific. Once in a while he was great. But if you take him strictly by his pitching record, it's not a Hall of Fame record. Now, plant the surgery in there. Tommy John had 12 serviceable and better seasons before his elbow blew out. He had 14 of them after the surgery. That makes him a Hall of Famer as a pioneer, in my book.
Good, very good point.
Oh, right now, I got to tell you my favorite Tommy John story. It always will be. When he was a Yankee once upon a time, he tangled in a game with the Angels, and Don Sutton opposed him. Now, Tommy John and Don Sutton had something in common. They were known for throwing, shall we say, stinker balls.
Junk balls.
Not quite. Let's put it this way. It took Lou Piniella, who was managing the Yankees at the time, to talk George Steinbrenner out of demanding the umpires frisk and arraign Sutton because they were likely to do the same thing with Tommy John. And after the Yankees won that game 2-1, a scout in the press box was heard to say, and I quote, "Tommy John and Don Sutton, if anyone can find one smooth ball from that game, he ought to send it to Cooperstown." That's what I mean by stinker ball.
Gotcha.
Don Mattingly. If all you needed was character, he'd be a Hall of Famer in a walk. The problem with Don Mattingly, he was a great player who should have been Hall of Fame great, but his back said, not so fast, Slick.
Right.
His back did him in. Yeah. Thurman Munson. Now, Munson is an odd case, sad but odd, because the plane crash that killed him in 1979 had the effect of elevating him above and beyond his real playing value. Just the way that the grumpy personality he showed the public had the effect of deflating it often as not. But if you look closer, Thurman Munson actually has a Hall of Fame case on his peak value. Not just because he was a Rookie of the Year and a Most Valuable Player award winner. Not just because he was dangerous in the postseason. But he found ways to get on base even when he wasn't swinging the bat well, especially in his last couple of seasons. He handled pitching staffs probably best of any catcher who wasn't named Yogi Berra on the Yankees. and the objective measurements on the 12th best catcher who ever got down behind the plate. And his peak value is above that of the average Hall of Fame catcher. It was easy to overrate and underrate him, but when you review the evidence objectively, and you also throw in he was as strong at stopping runs against his teams as he was for helping to create them, Thurman Munson has a Hall of Fame case. Dale Murphy is Don. Is
Let
the
me throw some. I'll throw that word at you. How much?
The intangibles the intangibles are a very tricky thing, and I wasn't even talking about intangibles with Thurman Munson. I'm talking strictly on the objective measurements, and he's a peak value Hall of Famer. Dale Murphy is the Don Mattingly of the outfield. His body did his Hall of Fame case in. If all you needed was with him too, if all you needed was character, he'd have been a Hall of Famer a long time ago. Unfortunately, Murphy had a comparatively short peak, and it came just short of a Hall of Fame level peak when his knees began betraying him. What Don Mattingly's back did to him, Dale Murphy's knees did to him.
And Colorado's ballpark doesn't really help him, or it did help his stats, but it doesn't help the way people look back.
He did nothing of the sort. He didn't play long enough in Colorado to have an effect, and his knees were gone to hell by that time. The real park factor that works against him is Atlanta Fulton County Stadium.
Okay.
Has a glaring home road split. But even putting all that aside, the bottom line is what Don Mattingly's back did to him, Dale Murphy's knees did to him. Knocked him out of the Hall of Fame running. Dave Parker is an interesting case on the sad side because his career should have been better. And with him, injuries got in the way too. And so did his cocaine use for a time. He was one of the Pittsburgh drug trial witnesses in 1985, I think it was. And he also played, Dave Parker, people may or may not remember this, but Dave Parker in some ways was like the Pete Reiser of his time. He played baseball like a Sherman tank on high test. He had big power, but he also thought that enemy infielders and catchers were papier-mâché walls to run through. He didn't realize at times that these were living, breathing humans who were just as liable to stand as strong against him on a baseball diamond as the linebackers he played against when he was a running back in high school. And that probably cost him the room to put up the kind of numbers that would have been Hall of Fame numbers. And Parker himself wonders about that now. In his career, he shook off the worst injury like it was just a mere nuisance. Not anymore. He's 2 years into a battle with Parkinson's disease. And he wonders to people who talk to him if he didn't cost himself the Hall of Fame. But I will tell you, I have a great story about Dave Parker. In fact, Thomas Boswell wrote about this after the A's got swept out of the 1990 World Series. I'm quoting from Boswell. Yep. I'm quoting from Tom Boswell now. Where is Dave Parker when you need a clubhouse enforcer? The A's always knew sooner or later they'd need Big Dave to quell a cell block riot, just as the 77 Reds desperately missed Tony Perez after they traded him. In '88, Jose Canseco popped off about beating the Dodgers in 5 games. The Dodgers won in 5. In '89, Parker promised to clean stuff and mount Jose if he spoke above a whisper. The A's swept. Now Dave's gone. Jose predicted a sweep. General manager Sandy Alderson makes a lot of good moves, but saving money on Parker may have cost him a world title.
Yes.
Ted Simmons. Ted Simmons is the best catcher who is not in the Hall of Fame. And I know a little story about him. You may not remember this, folks, but at the beginning of Simmons' career, he got within inches of making a reserve clause test case. This is a few years before Andy Messersmith finally did it. Simmons was as he was becoming a second-year player in '72, Simmons refused to sign his contract unless he got a $30,000 salary for that season. He had just become the Cardinals' regular catcher the year before, and his salary was $14,000. General manager Bing Devine said basically, "Not so fast, kid," offered him a low $20,000 salary. and Simmons decided to open the season without a signed contract. At the time, the rules said you couldn't do that unless your team renewed you, and the Cardinals did. They renewed him at a $20,000 salary. And he had Marvin Miller kind of watching him carefully because at one point Simmons pondered going to court with it. And at the time, Curt Flood's case hadn't yet been decided at the Supreme Court. Simmons played on, and come the All-Star break, he had 33 extra base hits, and he was named the backup catcher on the National League All-Star team. They played the game in Atlanta, and that's where Devine suddenly called him and offered him $75,000 for 2 years, the $30,000 he wanted for 1972 in the first place, and $45,000 for 1973. Simmons leaped on it. He couldn't help it. He was a young kid. But signing that deal, he gave Marvin Miller a huge piece of intelligence. It was mentioned in the book The Lords of the Realm by John Hellier. The Simmons deal proved to Miller that the owners would rather let a second-year kid catcher put $75,000 in his pocket than let any arbitrator get anywhere near the reserve clause just yet. So that was big for Miller and in time for Messersmith. Now from there, Simmons became one of the best hitting catchers ever to play. And he was a rarity at that position, a switch hitter.
Now, did he do this after his rookie season?
This was in the spring of his second season when he had the contract issue.
What a gutsy guy!
He did it. He had guts.
Yeah, where'd that come from?
Everyone who knew him said it. Where did what come? He'd been a football player.
In other words,
that's just the way he was.
Yeah.
It's just the way he was. Now, what's hampered Simmons in terms of the Hall of Fame, as I see it, later in his career he had defensive issues, especially his throwing arm. In fact, when Whitey Herzog traded him to the Brewers, Herzog was publicly critical of Simmons' defense, and that might have hurt him with some Hall of Fame voters. But you take a look at his entire game, he is considered objectively, and Baseball Reference cites this, as the 10th best catcher ever to strap it on. And as I said, he's the best catcher eligible for the Hall who isn't in it.
Is Bob Boone in it?
Bob Boone wasn't a Hall of Famer on the best day of his life. He was a good catcher, but not a Hall of Famer.
Okay, not as good as Simmons.
Ted Simmons was miles beyond. Lou Whitaker. I think the very thing that made Lou Whitaker admirable is the thing that probably kept him out of the Hall of Fame. There are those players who have made baseball look frighteningly easy to play. Whitaker was probably the best in his time at doing that. He made it look so easy that people mistook him for lacking effort or passion. Also, he was not one of the great self-promoters of the game. And yet he played 19 years. He formed a double-play combo with Alan Trammell that lasted almost the longest of any Keystone double-play combination in baseball history.
And you would think if he's in, if Trammell's in, Whitaker should be in.
I don't like to play the if-then game because I prefer to take a player on his individual merits. Lou Whitaker also has a sort of Warren Spahn problem. Now, Spahn was an obvious Hall of Fame pitcher, but if you look at his career closely, he didn't really have a peak, but he had a career depth. Warren Spahn got to the Hall of Fame because of his career depth. Lou Whitaker has that issue. Lou Whitaker is not a peak value candidate by any measure, but if you look at his career, his depth, it's a Hall of Fame second baseman. In a way, he's a kind of reverse Bobby Grich. Bobby Grich should get a second look, too. Now, Grich's peak value makes him a Hall of Famer, and he's overdue for that. Whitaker, it's strictly his career value that would make him a Hall of Famer.
Okay.
And I don't think Alan Trammell was the only one hoping on his own inauguration day that it wouldn't be long before Whitaker joins him there. And now the non-player. And if anyone really has to ask why Marvin Miller, who reshaped a dormant player's Association into a force that buried the reserve clause, let baseball players be paid their true market value, and have the right to hit the fair and open job market like any other American employee. If you have to ask why he's a Hall of Famer, then you must have been sleeping since around about the early Nixon administration.
Absolutely. What
Now I know Marvin Miller went to his grave saying that if he wasn't in by then, he didn't want to be elected. He didn't want to be on the ballot, and please don't let it happen. But unfortunately, history has its own way of redressing things, and there's nothing Marvin Miller can do now short of throwing lightning bolts down from the Elysian fields. But Marvin Miller is way overdue to go into the Hall of Fame.
Definitely concur on that one, sir. Who's next on your list?
That's the Modern Era Committee's list.
Okay.
And they'll announce the picks on December 8th.
Okay. I would say Parker is the best ball player on your list. Am I correct?
I disagree.
You're talking about Boone now, or you're talking about Simmons?
The best player on that list. It's a three-way heat between Thurman Munson, Ted Simmons, and Lou Whitaker, and Dwight Evans is a big maybe. And Tommy John
Parker,
is a yes as a pioneer.
Come up on those top 4 or 5 people in your mind?
Parker was a terrific player, but for the reasons I alluded to before, he comes up too far short.
Well,
according to Baseball Reference, no, it has nothing to do with the drugs and everything to do with the injuries.
Well, why is Keith?
According to Baseball,
not in?
He should be in. He's the best defensive first baseman who ever played the game.
Concur. But
now, according to Baseball Reference's rankings,
his ranking in that, not his ranking, but his involvement.
The drugs are irrelevant. It's not even a topic.
No, to you and me they are, but to the voter, doesn't that always stand in the back?
Well, of course it does to some, but that should not even be a topic. The bottom line is Keith Hernandez is the best defensive first baseman ever to play the game. Dave Parker is ranked as the number 39 right fielder of all time, and he's well enough below both the peak and the career levels of the average Hall of Fame right fielder.
Does that
Parker's body betrayed him. The drugs had nothing to do with it.
He also had the best arm in the National League at that time in right field. So I don't know how he could. He had a great arm, but he wasn't always a great fielder. I've seen a lot of outfielders who have great arms, but as great as their arms are, they just don't nail it. Okay.
Nobody that I've seen had a better throwing arm in right field than Vladimir Guerrero, other than Roberto Clemente. But Roberto Clemente made the plays more often.
Good point.
And Guerrero got into the Hall of Fame way more with his bat than he did with his play in the field. Parker had a great arm, but he didn't always make the plays.
That becomes, which plays didn't he always make? And that becomes very good fodder for talk shows, but it's hard for me to believe that he was bad enough.
Well, then believe this: his range factor was below the league average. His fielding percentage was below the league average, and as a right fielder, his career measure is that he was worth 12 runs lost to his team in right field.
Huh? Okay. Does that include his arm?
You can have all the and it's everything. You can have a great arm, but it doesn't do you any good if you're not getting the job done as often as you should, and he didn't.
Okay. He was a terrific hitter. No ball ever came off a bat faster than off of Dave Parker's.
Baloney. They jumped off the bat off Darryl Strawberry's bat faster.
Dick Allen too, perhaps, but
Dick Allen's bat made the two of them look like paper mache bats. And Dick Allen belongs in Cooperstown, and I think he's going to be considered next year by the Golden Era Committee.
I hope so. He does. So does Vinny Minoso.
Yeah, he will be, and Minoso should be there too.
And so does Gil Hodges.
But of the three of them, my number one choice would be Dick Allen.
Mine would be Minoso.
Allen was that overwhelming.
Mine would be Minoso because of the pioneer, including the pioneer that he was coming over from Cuba, and what.
Well, you know what? Well, there is a sometimes forgotten pioneer element to Dick Allen's career. Dick Allen,
chain smoker, horse race guy.
Let's get serious.
I'm gonna go get him right now. He's across the street. Come over here, Sirius. Tom Sirius. Meet Jeff Kallman. Go ahead.
Dick Allen had the misfortune of having to be the first black to play on the Little Rock, Arkansas Travelers, because the Phillies made them their AAA farm team, and that's where they sent Allen for his final seasoning, with absolutely no support system whatsoever, and it traumatized him. So Allen, in his way, was a pioneer too. Not to mention the fact that Philadelphia was still going through, shall we say, racial growing pains when Allen came up to the Phillies to stay.
A good person to equate that to, and his problems coming up, was Frank Robinson, whose Cincinnati Reds, they signed about 4 or 5 guys out of Oakland. Kurt Flood, Vader Vincent.
Yeah.
And
those are the guys who nicknamed Robinson pencils.
Okay.
Because his legs were so skinny, that's why they called him that. Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. They sent them to farm teams that were absolutely cracker cities like that, and that affected a lot of these guys' psyche. Of course,
yes, it did. Well, yeah. Robinson had a different minor league experience in Montreal. Oh God, how did that guy Wendell Smith of the old Pittsburgh Courier put it? When the Montreal Royals won the championship in the International League and Robinson was one of the team's stars, he got chased through the streets, and Wendell Smith said of that, it was the first time that a Negro was ever chased in the streets to be loved, not lynched, or something like that. I forget exactly how he said it. So Robinson had a different experience in Montreal.
It was totally a city that accepted interracial stuff and made it very easy for him.
Yeah, Robinson and Flood didn't always have it that easy. Dick Allen had it even worse in Little Rock.
Ironically, though, when Jackie Robinson came up, he had it worse than he had it in the minors.
Well, of course. I mean, Jackie Robinson being the first one was unfortunately bound to have that as the first.
Right.
But people often forget that the teams integrated kind of in phases. It didn't all happen at once. It happened like one team, then the other. It was like one after the other, a slow climb up. The Phillies were the last National League team to admit a black player, and this is in the late 50s, and the Red Sox were the last American League team to do it, also in the late 50s.
Was it Ruben Amaro?
No. Ruben Amaro didn't come around until the 60s.
Okay. I'm trying to think who that black player might have been. And the fact that that we don't know is either good or bad.
I can tell you who it was. It wasn't a player of Allen talent by any means. The 19
might have been a pitcher. Pedro Herrera, maybe. Remember, they came up. Ted Savage came up with Philadelphia. He was, but that might have been the 60s.
No, it was Pancho Herrera, an infielder.
It was Pancho.
I think that was him.
Boy, I got one out of 50. That's not bad.
Yeah.
Times
and Pancho Herrera in his minor league years, about the farthest south he ever got before he came up to the Phillies was Miami. He'd done his minor leagues in Syracuse and Schenectady before spending a little time in Miami before the Phillies called him up.
Check out the history of Syracuse and upstate New York in terms of prejudice. Don't underrate them in terms of despicable.
I don't think I would do that, but it wasn't like going to the deepest South where you knew going in that it was going to be trouble. Syracuse at least had the advantage, I suppose you could say, of being able to put up some sort of a small cloak over it, which you didn't get in the Deep South in those years.
I know, but sometimes one appreciates.
It's like you said, you had to dig deep.
Covert.
That's it. It's like you said yourself. You had to dig deep. You had to dig a little deeper to see it for what it was.
True, but like I say, sometimes one appreciates the covert or the overt as opposed to the covert. At least you know.
You know who your enemy is.
Yeah, you know what people are thinking about you. Thanks for telling me. In other words, the South is famous for that.
The issue Dick Allen had going to Little Rock was that what he experienced in Little Rock was almost entirely new to him. He grew up in a piece of Pennsylvania where blacks and whites commingled agreeably, including their kids. Now, they didn't date each other, but they hung together. So any kind of segregation, never mind the overt kind in Little Rock, was completely new and jarring to him.
Was he from Denora, where Griffey was from?
No, he was from Wampum.
Oh, okay, all right. All right. Who gave him trouble in the big leagues? Where did he get that reputation?
Well, Philadelphia itself wasn't exactly a hotbed of racial enlightenment in the middle to later 60s as it was. I think the real problem with Dick Allen began in earnest in 1965 when Frank Thomas, the big donkey version of Frank Thomas,
right,
picked a fight with him during practice one fine day and swung up and attacked him with a bat when Allen took a swing at him over his big mouth. And Gene Mock made a tragic mistake. He ordered the team to keep its mouth shut about the incident. At the same time, he shipped Frank Thomas out of town. Since Thomas was no longer on the team, Thomas could beat his gums about the incident. Allen and other Phillies had their mouths taped shut, and it gave Allen a bad rap right off the bat there because Thomas was popular in Philadelphia, even though he hadn't been there for very long. He was a pickup in 1964 for the pennant stretch.
Did Allen resent that in Mock?
Allen and Mock got along. It was only a couple of years later when scurrilous rumors began surrounding Allen that he really began trying to get away from the Phillies. Now, he thought Mock made a mistake in taping his and other teammates' mouths shut over the front incident. But by and large, from what I could have read, Allen and Mock weren't exactly enemies. Rumors about Allen's off-field behavior went crazy, and it seemed like nobody was willing to put a stop to it. And he put up with all kinds of racial incidents on the field and off the field as it was, and it was then, circa 1967, 1968, that Allen began trying actively to get out of Philadelphia.
What
The
were the
sad
rumors?
irony, there were rumors that he was cheating on his wife. It happened not to be true. There were also rumors that he was drunk. Allen was under the kind of pressure that would send a lot of young men in the working world to stop at the local tavern on the way home from work and have a couple of belts just to blow the edge off. The worst of the rumors was when he tore his wrist up trying to push his car up a driveway. It was said that he was drunk. He wasn't drunk. He pushed the car and it went through a headlight. The car was stalled.
So.
And the amazing thing is that through all this, Dick Allen could still play as well as he did.
Yeah,
what really began grinding him down as a player was injuries in the early to mid 70s.
He went to the White Sox. Had terrific success.
In due course, he did. Before that,
terrific success with Chuck Tanner. They got along marvelously.
They did.
Okay.
When Allen was traded out of Philadelphia, here's the sad irony. He was part of the trade that was supposed to make a Philly out of Curt Flood. The trade that Curt Flood decided meant enough was enough. He was going to challenge the reserve clause. To Dick Allen, it meant liberation.
Interesting.
He had a good year with the Cardinals, and the only reason they traded him after the year was because they needed to make room. They needed a young infielder with Dal Maxfield starting to show his age. He had a good year for the Dodgers, and it was well thought of over there. And they too needed pitching help. So that was how he ended up on the traded to the White Sox.
Okay. I forgot that he went to the Cardinals before going to the White Sox.
Yeah. And he went to the Dodgers before he went to the White Sox.
Ooh. Wow. That was the reconstruction of his career under Tanner that I remember.
The Cardinals traded him to the Dodgers because the Dodgers had a young infielder they could afford to expend, and the Cardinals were looking for some phasing Dal Maxfield out. The Dodgers traded Allen to the White Sox after one season because they needed pitching help. I think that was how the Dodgers got Tommy John.
Reminds
before
me
the elbow
of
injury.
Bobby Bonds, who one day in one argument somebody said, Bobby Bonds gets traded a lot. He must be this, that, and the other thing. But the other guy said in the argument, Bobby Bonds gets traded for a lot. So you have to take, somebody wants you. As long as somebody wants you.
Also, if you're looking for a particular part, you need to be able to trade value, and Dick Allen had value to burn.
Right.
And at the time, the Cardinals needed middle infield help a lot more than they needed a power hitting first baseman. And a year later, the Dodgers needed pitching help badly, more than they needed a power hitting first baseman. So you trade value for value, and Dick Allen had value to burn.
Trades are interesting. A book that sits right on my desk at all times is called The Baseball Trade Register by Joseph Reichler. And if ever you're looking, go to, eBay or what have you. I'm sure it's out of print by this time. Every trade and transaction in Major League history is in this
I've got
easy
a good book in my library that talks about a lot of particularly memorable trades, among other things. It's called Rob Neyer's Big Book of Baseball Blunders.
Haven't seen that one. I saw his lineup book.
I have that.
His pitching book. His lineup book, I browsed it once and didn't buy it. Haven't seen it since. I'm going to go to eBay to buy his lineup.
I have that book, and I have his book of baseball legends, and I have his book of baseball blunders.
Okay, tell me about baseball blunders. What's that?
Basically, it's a book of the worst decision. Here's the subtitle: A Complete Guide to the Worst Decisions and Stupidest Moments in Baseball History.
Okay.
And among other things in there, and whole chapters are devoted to these. The foul-ups, bleeps, and blunders include, but are not limited to, Babe Ruth trying to steal second in Game 7 of the 26 World Series, the Braves signing Babe Ruth.
Closed out the
Was
series. That's stolen base.
Also, it mentions Joe McCarthy starting Denny Galehouse, the A's trading Roger Maris, Casey Stengel's mistake with Whitey Ford in the 60 World Series, and there's a chapter called Managers Who Shouldn't Have Been. Also, such deals as the Frank Robinson for Milt Pappas trade. He talks about that. He talks about
Cepeda. How about Cepeda for Sadecki?
He actually doesn't talk about that one, but what he does talk about is burying Amos Otis and putting their fate in the hands of Joe Foy. He talks about the Red Sox trading Sparky Lyle to the Yankees. He talks about, where's that other one? He talks about Jeff Bagwell for Larry Anderson.
Doesn't mention Donnie Bosch, does he? As a Met fan, that came up in my head.
Don who?
Remember Donnie Bosch? We've had an interesting team to follow. We're going to close it out. Tell us about where people out there can read you. You are one of the most fascinating. You have one of the most fascinating baseball minds, and you have an internet column. It's called Throneberry Fields. How do they reach you?
You can read me at throneberryfields.com. You can also read me periodically at FanCred Sports and at the Hardball Times.
Beautiful. He is Jeff Kallman on Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. That's what we're going to do this winter. We're going to talk a little hot stove league baseball all winter long because you keep it interesting, my friend.
Well, next week we should be talking awards because they'll be handing them all out this week.
Beautiful. We have a topic already in place. Be healthy. Look forward to it. Jeff Kallman, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tyko, the weak link of it all. Do us a favor. While I'm thinking of it, if you're out there listening, box up some new or lightly used children's books and take them on over to the Head Start program in whatever community you live in. I can't tell you how much good that would do on one podcast. I'll summarize. Give kids a passion. Make them school ready. Get their noses out of the devices and what have you. And it would be wonderful. These are kids that need those books more than your average kid on the street. So do that. Get some from your neighbors. Have a drive. Do what it takes. If you enjoy this or any of the offerings Uncomfortably Zoned, and it'll make me feel good. And I'll know it. There are vibes in the air. Hey, thank you, Jeff. Great show.
Oh, I got one. I think I have one more hot one for you. Pete Alonso has just won the National League Rookie of the Year.
Oh, did he really? Right off? And, ooh.
He got 29 out of the 31st place votes.
Whoa. No surprise, but it's nice to hear it being concrete.
And we'll talk more about the awards next week.
Thank you again for your time, Mr. Kallman.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening, everybody. Adios. The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.